So tonight I'm going to present the findings from my book that was just published in January, and as well as some findings from some current research which is related to this. Okay, so I thought I'd start out with the title of an op-ed that was written by Margot Wallström that appeared in The Guardian in March. And Margot Wallström is Sweden's foreign minister. And she wrote this op-ed that's titled, "Serious Peace Talks Need More Women at the Table." So she is calling for Syrian women to be included at any peace talks that happen on the Syrian conflict. And she claims that women at the peace table will be a strong voice for peace, and that it's more likely that they're going to achieve peace if women are at these peace talks, and also it's more likely that peace is going to be implemented if women are there. And the research supports this finding, not my research, because I've looked at women's participation in the peace process, in peace processes. Other people have published research on what is actually the concrete result of women being there. So there is some new research out, not a lot. It's very kind of this research, this field is very much in its infancy, that shows that women's participation in peace negotiations is indeed conducive to reaching a peace agreement, firstly, and secondly, that women's participation in a peace process, either as mediators, negotiators, as members of civil society, as members of the main negotiating teams, will increase the durability of a peace settlement. And so my research comes at a time of increased focus on women's participation in peace negotiations. And many of you might know that since the year 2000, the UN Security Council has actually passed 7 resolutions that call for women to be included in all aspects of peacemaking and peace negotiations and peace building, and as well as their needs to be considered, so gender to be mainstream essentially in any decisions that are made around conflict resolution and peace implementation. So although the focus of women's participation in peace negotiations has now gone mainstream, women have been calling for it for a long time, and it's only been recently that it has become mainstream in international politics. So I thought I'd start with this example to illustrate a number of themes that are relevant to my talk. So this is a picture of some women who attended the Women's Peace Conference that was held in The Hague in the Netherlands in 1915. So over 1,200 women from over 30 countries got together and they held a peace conference. And they had several objectives. So of course their primary objective was to end World War I. But they had other objectives. First of all, they called for gender-inclusive peace talks. Said any peace talks that should be held, women need to be at the table. We have a right to be there too. They called for an all-women's peace conference, in addition to any peace conference that would be held by men. And thirdly, they called for universal suffrage. So their objectives went beyond just ending the conflict. They also wanted to they wanted particular things in their home states, and they wanted to build a particular type of society. So I refer to this as peace plus. And in most of the literature on women and peace negotiations, women are always framed, or in the most part framed, as kind of cheerleaders for the peace process. But they're more than that. They also have their own political objectives. They're complex actors, and they want to achieve they want to advance certain objectives through the peace negotiations, which is why I call my book Windows of Opportunity, because essentially they see peace negotiations as an opportunity to become involved in politics in their states. And so, so 3 things I want that are particularly relevant here is their gender identity here trumped their national identity, or at least that's how they framed their identity, right? As them being more important that they were women, as opposed to being Americans or British or Germans or Belgians, etc. Also, they were working outside their national structures, okay? Now, the reason they're working outside their national structures is because they've been shut out from their national structures, right? And we're going to see that with the examples I'll give tonight. Women generally aren't able to be part of mainstream negotiating teams or political parties. Okay, so in order for them to participate, they have to form all women's parties, all women's organizations, in order to claim to have a voice, in order to be allowed to participate. And then thirdly, as I mentioned before, their objectives are more than just achieving a peace, a ceasefire. They want to build a particular type of post-conflict state. Okay, so I started out my research looking at 195 peace agreements which are signed between 1975 and 2011. And I found that, and I looked for references to women. And as you can see, there are very few from 1975 to about 1990. And then onwards, so this is the global count, so this is cumulative. You see an exponential increase in the number of references to women, or peace agreements that have at least one reference to women in them. In fact, about 30% of peace agreements during this time period, so that's 55 out of 195, have references to women in them. So, and that number is actually higher if we look at, because sometimes conflicts produce multiple peace agreements. So for example, in Guatemala, from 1990 to 1996, there were 16 peace agreements that were produced. So if we just count in terms of the number of conflicts that produce peace agreements, we find that 40% of conflicts that produced at least one peace agreement produced at least one with a reference to women in it. So I thought this was interesting. So first of all, that we have this increasing prevalence after 1989. So end of the Cold War, we start to get more references to women in peace agreements. Also, I thought it was quite interesting that the way in which the women's rights are framed is fairly homogeneous. Almost exclusively, they are framed in human rights language. And I expected something very different. I would have expected that the way that Burundians, for example, would articulate women's rights would be very different from Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, or Guatemala. And what I found, actually, that these are essentially, they're all framed, for the most part, there's a few small exceptions, are framed in in international norms. They're congruent with international norms on women. Thirdly, they are clauses that are not just about the immediacies of the conflict. Okay, they're not just about refugee return or redress for sexual violence. They also have a long-term scope. I'll talk about those. I'll show this on the next slide. Okay. So in my book, I break down the clauses into time periods. So I have the first time period is that related specifically to the conflict. The second is related to the transition from conflict to post-conflict. And the third is like clauses that are meant to affect women's role in the state in the long term. So for example, we do see a number of clauses that have to do with the conflict. So redress for sexual violence, for example. So an example of this would be the 2003 inter-Congolese political negotiations. It was a peace agreement related to the conflict in the Congo, which grants the National Truth and Reconciliation Commissions the authority to hear cases related to wartime rape and sexual assault, and establishes psychological rehabilitation centers for women and girls. As well, in the Burundian peace agreement signed in the year 2000, we see the agreement targets the issue of confiscated or appropriated property, calling for its restoration to women who lost it during the conflict. Traditionally, women were unable to inherit property in Burundi. This meant that a number of women lost control over their family homes due to the deaths of their husbands or fathers during the conflict. This marks then a significant change in policy for an outstanding ban on women's inheritance in Burundi. We also see the establishment of electoral quotas for women in peace agreements. So for example, in the 1997 Bangladesh Chittagong Hills Tract Agreement, it stipulates that women shall have 3 seats on every municipal council. And as well, in the Congolese peace agreement, we have a 30% quota for women on all national decision-making bodies. And in Burundi, there's a 20% quota for women's involvement in the Transitional National Assembly. Regarding the creation of new institutions, in Guatemala, 1996, we have the agreement calls for the establishment of an Office for the Defense of Indigenous Women's Rights, which would provide legal advisory services and social services. As well, we have a number of aspirational clauses. For instance, in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, there's a clause that states that women, the agreement promotes women's equal participation in public life. And there's a number of clauses like that that don't specify anything specific, but just specify general principles of equality. So the three research questions that the book tries to answer are, first of all, why and how are women's rights included in contemporary peace agreements? So what is driving this? What is going on? Secondly, why do they overwhelmingly reflect international norms on women? Like, why aren't we seeing more regional variation? And thirdly, what are the key factors that determine whether or not peace agreements are gender inclusive? So are there some factors that make it more likely that a certain peace agreement is going to have women's rights in it, as opposed to another agreement that does not have women's rights in it? And why is this important? So I think for a number of reasons. So for policy reasons, of course, it's obviously an important question as to whether or not women get to be at peace talks to influence the outcome of peace negotiations, as well as influence the post-conflict institutions in their state. It's also obviously it's a concern now of the United Nations, of a number of mainstream bodies. It's become a mainstream issue. And theoretically, I think it's quite an interesting question as well. There's a large body of literature in sociology that looks at gender role transformation and social rupture. So there's a number of theorists have observed that conflicts, although are obviously deleterious to women and to people generally, often have some silver lining and offer some kind of window of opportunity for change. The reasons for this the reasons given are that women and men play different roles during conflict than they would during peacetime. So for example, women might serve in armed forces. They might become heads of household if their spouse is away fighting. They may run businesses. They might become involved in peace advocacy in the public sphere. They may attend UN transnational peace activist meetings. As well, if there's a lot of population displacement, displaced populations might be exposed to new ideas about gender norms in their place of displacement that they may then bring back when they return. As well, when there is a political transition, new institutions might be created. And those new institutions will not already be populated by incumbents. So political outsiders will have more of an opportunity to be able to participate in new political institutions. And so anyway, no one has really looked at the role that peace negotiations yet play in social rupture, and this is what this project has tried to do. As well, there's a large body of literature on peace building, which claims that the objective of peace building is to create liberal democracies. So to create new states in the model of Western liberal democracies. So there's an assumption that there's a bias there. If you're critical or you support it, everyone agrees generally that that is the case, that there is this bias to create certain types of state. So you would expect that perhaps with this liberal bias that women's rights would just be included as part of that. But it turns out in my research that that is not the case at all. Women have had to fight very hard to have a voice at peace negotiations and have women's rights inserted into peace agreements. So I think that's interesting. As well, I think this is relevant for how we understand how ideas transfer from one place to another, norms or standards of behavior regarding women's rights. And to date, the peace process has not been a place where scholars have looked. And as well, regarding how we understand mediation and negotiations to work, typically women's participation has been viewed as a bit too simplistic. They've been viewed as kind of cheerleaders for the peace process without really understanding them as political actors, and also having their own complex agendas and complex strategies for achieving those objectives. So what I've done, so the way I undertook this study was in two parts. And the first was by looking at 3 case studies. And I chose to look at the 1998 Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland, the year 2000 Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement for Burundi. So both of those agreements have women's rights in them. And I chose them because they were very dissimilar. So you would assume that if there is any something particular that drives the inclusion of women in peace negotiations and rights in their agreements, that maybe this case would have, they had a lot of things dissimilar, but we'd expect maybe something that was similar. So that might be a good way to start by identifying it. And then I chose a case where women's rights are not in the peace agreement, and that's the case of Macedonia, the 2001 ORED Framework Agreement. And then I looked at the 195 peace agreements and ran some analyses on those to see if we could find other, first of all, I did kind of an overview of the clauses in these agreements, and then coded them to see if we could find anything else that would tell us what makes it more likely that an agreement is going to have women's rights in it. And each of these case studies I looked at in 5 parts. So I looked at who the actors were, so who were the people who were responsible for putting women's rights in the peace agreements. Second, I looked at how those actors were mobilized, so how they came to be involved in the negotiations. Thirdly, I looked at their objectives, or what they wanted to achieve. Fourthly, what strategies they used. And fifthly, how they actually constructed the actual women's rights clauses that are in the peace agreements. And I found a lot of similarities between the cases. So first of all, I found in all cases that the actors were local women's advocacy groups. So in these 3 cases, there was actually no one from the international community that had independently tried to insert women's rights into the peace agreements. What had happened in each case is local women's groups had got together and they had said, we want to be part of the peace talks. And it was quite interesting that they were already linked in to transnational networks. Okay, so it was very interesting to me that the women in Northern Ireland, for example, knew women peace activists in Guatemala. Okay, they knew them, they knew they had inserted language, they had gone to UN conferences together. As well, during the negotiations in both Burundi and Northern Ireland, negotiating teams had actually gone to South Africa to work with individuals who had worked on drafting the post-apartheid constitution in South Africa. So it's very easy to actually draw these transnational linkages, and that was a big surprise for me too, actually, that these women actually knew each other, and there was already a transnational kind of feminist network there that these women were part of. Also, these women were typically already involved in feminist advocacy. So they had, so getting involved, trying to get involved in the peace process was not their first time being involved in civil society. So in Burundi, a number of these women were part of NGOs. Same thing in Northern Ireland. Were part of kind of civil society, they were political activists in some way. And the big surprise here, of course, was this was not driven by elite actors. Okay, there was no kind of international mediators who were just saying, okay, you have to include women's rights, just put them in. This was very much driven by local women's groups. And the picture there is a book about the Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition, so the political party, that women's political party that participated in the peace talks in Northern Ireland. So I found in both cases, or in all cases, actually all 3 cases I looked at, there were 2 phases to women's mobilization. So first, there was a response to the conflict. Okay, so as a response to the conflict, women formed peace NGOs, or they used already existing NGOs. So in Northern Ireland, a famous peace NGO that was formed was called the Peace People. and it was largely driven by women who were trying to seek a peaceful end to the conflict in Northern Ireland. And then once women had established these NGOs, and they also did other things like organize, like in Burundi, they organized a peace march. In Macedonia, they would stand, they'd use the typical protest that the women in black use, which is a silent protest in squares, just holding signs calling for peace. And the second phase was, in all three cases, once peace talks were announced, women in all three countries demanded to be part of them. They wanted to be part of these peace talks. So what were their objectives? So as I already mentioned, yes, they wanted to end the conflict, but they also wanted gender equality. And they also saw these talks as opportunities to advance gender equality. So for example, in Northern Ireland, I found a document put out by the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition where they called specific, and they have this explicitly, they said, this is what we think we can achieve by being part of the Northern Ireland peace talks. First of all, we want to raise women's visibility in politics. We think we would like we want women's participation in politics to be more visible. Secondly, they wanted to use this as leverage to pressure other parties to field female candidates. So if they thought if they field female candidates, other parties would have to as well. Thirdly, they wanted to ensure gender parity in post-conflict institutions. They actually sought to have 50-50 gender parity in the institutions that were created by the Good Friday Agreement. And fourthly, they wanted a new electoral system. They wanted an electoral system that was going to be more conducive to smaller parties participating, including parties like the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. So what kind of strategies did they use? Okay, so in all three cases, we see similar strategies, and although in the Macedonian case, we see one key difference, which I'll point out after. So in all three cases, we see them using strategies to unite their movement. Because obviously, a problem in a divided society, if you're trying to have a cross-community organization, is you don't want to replicate the fissures of the conflict. So that's a difficult thing to do. So what women's groups did was they focused on having a gender-based identity. Okay? So they talked about their primary identity not as being in Burundi, not as being Hutu or Tutsi, or in Northern Ireland, not as being Protestant or Catholic, or in Macedonia this actually became a problem, but they also in Macedonia they tried not to identify. They said we're both Macedonian and we're ethnic Albanians, and we're working together. Our primary identity is as women. In Northern Ireland, they had emphasized their role as women in holding the society together during the conflict. In Burundi, they talked about their roles as wives and mothers and how they'd suffered as a result of the conflict. Also, they were visibly cross-community. So they had a gender-based identity, but they wanted to show that they were from neither. They were from both communities in all cases. So the leadership in the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition was one nationalist and one unionist, so one Protestant and one Catholic. In the original 7 observers in the Burundi peace process, there were 7 of them. 4 were one ethnicity, 3 were the other. And again, in Macedonia, they emphasized this by holding signs in both in both Macedonian and in Albanian when they did their peace protests. Now, thirdly, in the 2 successful cases in Northern Ireland and Burundi, they maintained neutrality on the really contentious issues of the conflict. So in the case of Northern Ireland, they said, we do not discuss the constitutional question. We don't have a position on whether Northern Ireland should remain part of the United Kingdom or join Ireland. They said, we don't have a position on this, we just want it to be decided peacefully, and we'll accept whatever decision is peaceful. In the case of Burundi, they didn't speak about who was responsible for the genocide, for example. Okay? They didn't touch those issues. And probably for 2 reasons. Firstly, it might have divided their groups. And secondly, it would have meant they would not have had been seen as a unique constituency for participation in the peace talks. If they just had a position that was similar to other political parties, they would have had probably a less of a claim to be at the peace negotiations. Now, of course, this was also a technique that was used by the UN in Burundi. So the women in Burundi were successful in worked with allies in both Kenya and in New York in the United Nations to have an all-women's peace conference in Burundi. So they'd been observers at the talks. Then they were able to have an all-women's peace conference where they took a draft negotiation that the men had negotiated, and then they inserted a number of gender provisions into it. And so there was women from civil society there, and then the political parties would only agree to this if they could appoint 2 women from each of their political parties. And there were 17 political parties, so there's 34 women who came also. So the UN ran that conference, and they used this neutrality as a way of making sure that you don't have kind of the issues of the conflict erupting at the negotiations. So they emphasized, okay, we're here to discuss women's issues only. We're looking at only we're looking at only issues that are relevant to women, not the main issues of the conflict. And obviously this is I find this aspect a bit troubling. And I'll talk more about this at the end, but briefly I'll say that I think it's problematic that for women to be involved in politics, they have to say things like, hey, we're not really touching the main political issues, we're just representing women, right? Because certainly they should have a voice about all issues and should be part of mainstream political institutions. Okay, and to access the peace talks, we see both framing, so they're framing themselves in a particular way, I've talked about, as being representatives of women, having a unique political agenda, and as well as framing themselves as having a right to be at the talks. So for example, in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition put out a number of press releases saying things like, okay, you've talked about inclusivity at the talks between unionists and nationalists. We also want to see gender inclusivity. So they took kind of already agreed upon principles and said, okay, these apply to us too. We have a right to be here too. Also, they used leverage politics. So in the case of Burundi, the women were successful in having actors, so other prominent women politicians in Uganda and Rwanda helped support their calls to be present at the peace negotiations. They also worked with the United Nations at both the regional and the regional office in Kenya and the headquarters in New York. Okay, so that kind of answers my first question of like kind of how these women's rights are now being included in peace agreements, at least in those cases. And then the second question is, why were these rights framed in human rights language? Why don't we see more variation in the types of roles that are framed that frame women in these peace agreements? And I think this is happening for 3 reasons. So firstly, there were these direct contacts, as I mentioned. So these women in Northern Ireland knew peace activists in Guatemala. Okay, so they knew each other. They'd also, in all 3 cases actually, women who were involved in the peace negotiations had all been to UN women's conferences. Okay, so they were familiar with international human rights documents on women. So yes, they know these documents. And thirdly, this was their identity. There was not a struggle for them as, what do human rights mean for me as a Burundian, Northern Ireland, woman from Northern Ireland? Like when I'd ask them about these, why did you choose human rights framing? And they would just say things like, well, I just took it for granted. I mean, this is kind of how we talk about women's rights. And I think this was due to the particular identity of these women as being involved in transnational feminist networks. So there was not really, I don't see it as an imposition of rights upon them. It's actually the way that they have lobbied for gender equality within their respective contexts. So when I compare the 3 cases, we see what's present. So we see in all 3 cases this gender-based identity. Okay, so them saying, okay, we're women first and foremost. Secondly, we do see cross-community representation, so kind of visible, so we have people who would be identified as being from both communities in all three cases. But in the positive cases, in Burundi and Northern Ireland, we see this neutrality on conflict-related issues, where in the Macedonian case, we don't. So in the Macedonian case, the women's movement ends up splitting. So there's the main women's movement that they claim to be, I mean, they have representatives from both the ethnic Albanian and the ethnic Macedonian populations, but they weigh in on the conflict and they weigh in on who's responsible. So they call the Albanian insurgents, they call them terrorists. They call for them to be arrested. When there were some police officers who were killed, Macedonian police officers, they would send their condolences and say they support them against the terrorists that are causing the conflict. Okay, so and I wonder if the reason for this is that, and I don't know if the conflict in Macedonia though is much shorter than the other conflicts, and I think that probably what's happened is in the other cases these women have more time to become effective political actors and to gain traction in their cases. They have more time to lobby decision makers, and they have more time to figure out amongst themselves what works, right? What is going to keep their movement cohesive, what's going to give them maximum kind of political leverage. So it seems like there's something there with the time. And in the case of Macedonia, it's also kind of interesting because this is the only case that happened post after the Security Council had issued a resolution calling for women to be present at the peace negotiations. There was heavy involvement by the European Union as well as the US, and yet there were no women at the peace talks. Even though they asked to be invited to the peace talks, and they were not granted, they were not allowed to have access to the peace talks. As a result, the Macedonian peace agreement does not have any references to women in it, because there were no women there to lobby for that. Although you might have expected that these international actors might have been aware of Security Council Resolution 1325 and would have had some pressure placed on them. That's actually, I think, a very interesting possible topic for future research, because I don't know why the international actors didn't feel more pressure to do that. So these are my findings then from the case studies. And now we're moving on to show you the findings from the cross-national analysis. So this is like the quantitative, the data set that I used. And this next part is, it's a little more advanced than what's in the book. And this is a current paper I'm working on with Dr. Liam Swiss, who is, he did all the quantitative analysis here. It's my background, my research is more qualitative. He's a sociologist at Memorial University. And so what we looked at is whether or not, so what factors actually seem to predict whether or not women's rights are going to be included in a peace agreement. And we looked at 4 levels. So we looked at the degree of social rupture, which we measured by how long a conflict was, how intense it was, so how many battle-related deaths, and as well as the level of reported sexual violence. We also looked at the type of peace agreement, so how complex it is, what time frame it targeted, and whether or not there were third-party mediators there, say from other countries, international organizations. We looked at whether or not female parliamentary representation or female labor force participation mattered. So did it matter that there were already more women in parliament, or whether or not there was more women's participation in the labor force? Was that what was driving the inclusion of women's rights in peace agreements? And then we looked at the time period in which an agreement was signed, because we did expect that we would see more women's rights in peace agreements following, for example, key international documents on women, like the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Beijing Declaration, Security Council Resolution 1325, and then the count of women's rights accords, which means, did it matter, is there a contagion effect? So is it more likely that if your peace agreement is signed when there's already 49 that have women's rights in them, is it more likely that that peace agreement is going to have women's rights in them? Do these agreements influence each other? And what we found was the biggest determinant for whether or not women's rights would be found in a peace agreement was actually social rupture. And this accords with what I noticed from the 3 case studies, in that the one with the shortest conflict, Macedonia, has no women's rights in it, whereas the longer conflicts do. And so we see this. So the longer a conflict is, the more likely it is that women's rights are going to be included in the peace agreements. So for every year increase of a conflict, the odds of a women's rights being included in that peace agreement increased by 5%. So a conflict of 15 years, which is the median in our sample size, nearly doubles the odds of including women's rights provision rather than a short 1-year conflict. Similarly, we measured the battle-related deaths, and it's either over 1,000 or under 1,000. So conflicts with a higher intensity are more likely to include women's rights in them. And similarly, conflicts with higher levels of sexual violence are more likely to include women's rights in the peace agreement. Now, I think these findings are quite disturbing, and so we've issued our paper that we're hoping to publish soon is called "A High Price to Pay," because it seems like the threshold actually for women's rights to be recognized in peace negotiations has to do with having come out of a more horrific conflict, which is very problematic. And it also goes to show how persistent traditional gender norms are that keep women from participating in the public sphere and in peace negotiations. And that clearly we need significant resources to be devoted to gender equality, because it doesn't just happen on its own. It happens, it's more likely to happen in cases of severe social disruption, rupture that obviously no one should have to go through. So in conclusion, women activists are the primary drivers behind the inclusion of women's rights in peace negotiations. They are linked to transnational networks, which is why we see this replication of human rights language. And we also see that greater social rupture is related to the inclusion of women's rights. Some current, sorry, my slides are out of order. Okay. So the implications for this. Okay, so there are many so a few here. So first of all, we don't see a huge increase in women's rights and peace agreements after UN Resolution 1325. So the question is, why isn't it more effective? How can we make it more effective? As I said before, clearly resources worldwide need to be devoted for greater gender inclusivity, both peace negotiations and for women's participation in the public sphere, because there's clearly a very high threshold for women to be in key political processes. Also, it's problematic that women's maintaining neutrality on conflict-related issues, or not being able to speak to conflict-related issues and only to focus on, quote, women's issues only, is problematic. And it speaks to the fact that women are still not welcome in the public sphere. And there are all sorts of barriers against women's participation in politics. Yes, I was going to say one more thing about that. Maybe it'll come back. So as far as the theoretical implications, clearly women's participation in peace negotiations are part of this phenomenon of what we see of the gender role transformation due to kind of social rupture. Even though there might be a liberal bias in peace building, it's still necessary to have activists to kind of claim those rights. We do see peace negotiations as a place where international norms on women are being further cemented into different states worldwide. And speaking to mediation negotiation theory, we see that women should probably be conceptualized as more complex actors and not only be concerned with a small fraction, only being concerned with a ceasefire, achieving peace. Okay. Also, a big question that comes from this is, does it matter if women's rights are in peace agreement? Does it matter for women? This refers to an article that Liam Swiss and I published in Politics and Gender in March 2014. And we found that in cases where women's rights were included in the peace agreement, it was the time to which that country adopted a women's electoral quota was 5 times as fast as if they were not included. Okay? So we see some relationship between legislative gains for women in the post-conflict period. And as I mentioned before, there are other scholars who are doing research on whether or not women's participation in peace agreements affects the durability of peace, and some preliminary findings suggest they do, and as well as durability of peace, as well as they increase the likelihood of reaching a peace agreement. Also, a question, this is some more work I'm doing now in the case of Burundi, looking at if women's participation in the peace agreement, the peace process, translates into sustained political participation. Do women gain political experience during peace negotiations that then translates into them being more active in formal politics following in the post-conflict period? Also, and I think this is kind of the very important takeaway here, I think we have to note there's a very high threshold for women's participation in processes that should be that women should deserve to have a place at the table, and as well, women are often have to operate through these women's only these women's only structures because they are shut out from mainstream structures. So I think this speaks to the increased efforts that are necessary to get women to have women accepted into mainstream political structures. And that is my talk. Thank you.